This is the first video in a series on Edmund Burke, the 18th century writer, and we're going to be looking at his longer work, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful, which is quite the mouthful, isn't it? But the main way to remember that is just to think about these concepts of the sublime and the beautiful. Before we get there, though, in subsequent videos, I'd like to start by actually looking at his short work on taste, which became the preface of this longer work in the second edition. So in 1759, Burke added this to his philosophical inquiry. Now, Burke is very confident that he can define what taste is, or at least how taste is constructed, and he gives us this definition of taste. He says, "I mean by the word taste no more than that faculty or those faculties of the mind which are affected with or which form a judgment of the works of the imagination and the elegant arts." It seems from that definition that Burke sees taste as a faculty by itself, although right away after that he suggests that it might be multiple faculties. And as we go on, we'll actually see that taste kind of blends with a number of other things, including the senses, the imagination, and the judgment or the intellect. So it's hard to say sometimes whether taste is its own faculty or if it's really a mixture of all these different things. Now, before we look at Burke's particular theory, let's have a quick peek at a modern work of art. And it's good to do this because modern art has so influenced our sense of taste that a lot of us would say that taste is subjective. If we look at this painting Black Square from 1915 by Kazimir Malevich, some of us might say, well, that's not art. And others might say, well, that's just your opinion. And before we know it, everything is subjective. Burke, if he had been alive to see this, he probably would talk about the concept of knowledge. And we'll come back to this later, but I'm just going to preview this a little bit now. One of the things that Burke will say is that the more knowledge we have, the more we are able to make sound judgments about things. And as an example here, scholars have found out that underneath this black paint, it actually says something. It says Battle of Negroes in a Black Cave. As it turns out, that's a racist joke. It's not a very good joke, obviously. And it's influenced by an earlier French work of art which made the same terrible joke. So, does that knowledge help us in developing our taste? First of all, it might turn us off from this painting. We might say, well, that's racist and I'm not interested in it anymore, which is fair enough. But the bigger question also is, does knowledge help us to make an informed and sound judgment? And Burke seems to think that the answer is yes. So that's something that we'll come back to. Now, as we zoom into his theory then, even though he ends up talking about knowledge, he starts us off by thinking about the senses. Okay, and that's where maybe you'll see some tension in his theory as well, that on the one hand, he's very much focused on the senses, on our sensual experience of the world, and on the other hand, he's quite intellectual as well. So that tension is something we'll talk about. Now, by focusing on the senses, Burke is very influenced by John Locke. So John Locke, the philosopher. And Locke was an empiricist. So Locke believed that all our information comes to us through the senses. That's how we experience the world. That's how we know what's real. And that's where he starts his scientific endeavors. Burke very much follows John Locke. And he argues that for us, the senses are kind of universal. So if we want to base our standard of taste in something, we should base it in the senses. And if we look at something like sugar, for instance, which we can taste and feel, we are all going to have fairly similar notions of what sugar is. We will say, well, sugar is sweet. And if that's universal, then we can say, well, maybe taste, at least on the literal level, is universal, right? Some of us might have our senses dulled. Some of us might not be able to taste very well or have very strange abnormalities, but most of us will agree that sugar is sweet. Another example here, Burke talks about this expression, the cup of bitterness. There's a reason why poets can say these things, because we know what bitter is. So we know that bitterness can stand for suffering. There are, of course, some things that don't seem to fit his theory. So if you think of something like tobacco, at least when you first try it, doesn't taste very good, and yet tons of people find it pleasant and enjoyable. So how does that fit within his theory of taste? Well, Burke says that with things like tobacco and opium, over time, we come to see their benefit. Okay, so we see their benefit, their usefulness. And because we see their usefulness and we use these products more and more, over time our taste gets used to it, and we think that this is actually delicious or really great. So, on this basis then of the senses, Burke next turns to the imagination, which is probably the most important faculty that he talks about. Some scholars actually suggest that taste is the imagination for Burke, that there's so much overlap that we can pretty much make them the same. I would be a bit hesitant with that, but there's definitely a lot of emphasis on the imagination. Burke suggests that the imagination is incredibly limited by the senses. We can only imagine based on what our senses take in. So even if we imagine some fanciful creature like a phoenix, right, or a manticore, we are using our sense impressions to create this fantastic being. Now, the third faculty is our judgment. And by judgment, Burke means our intellect, our reason. So if we think about the connection between the imagination and the judgment, Burke says that the imagination is all about finding resemblances between things, whereas judgment is about finding differences. And in this distinction, Burke is following John Locke. So Burke suggests that if you think about resemblance, think about a poetic line. For instance, I wandered lonely as a cloud, Wordsworth. In that line, Wordsworth is saying, I am similar to a cloud, loneliness is similar to wandering. All of these things resemble each other. So the imagination is about finding unity, about imitation, about resemblance. And our judgment is about finding differences. For example, when we're writing an essay, we are analyzing, we are examining, we are discerning the differences between things. So the imagination, then, we can see that this is to some extent limited by the senses. Our judgment often deals with very different things. For instance, it also deals with things like proper behavior and manners. Okay, so what are good manners? Is that in good taste, what you just did? And judgment then is this whole range of things, from saying, well, your scarf is ugly, to making a judgment about somebody's behavior. That is not good, right? That's in bad taste. As an aside, by the time you get to the philosopher Nietzsche, Nietzsche will actually suggest that, especially in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, his famous work, he'll suggest that because there is no good and evil, except what we make up ourselves, this whole question of taste comes right back. Everything is, in a sense, a matter of taste. In other words, by allowing judgment to deal with all of these things, and then by talking about it in relation to taste, Burke is definitely doing something here that is somewhat controversial, I would say. Okay, now, as we look at this big picture then, for Burke, all of these things, because they are rooted in the senses, are quite limited. We're all going to have a similar imagination to some extent. We're going to have the same kind of reason, the same kind of standards. And so if somebody makes a terrible judgment, it's because they haven't been educated properly. It's because they have very little knowledge. It's because they just don't understand things. And that means then that through education is really key here, through education, we can better ourselves and we can have a better sense of taste. As we think about education then, we come back to the issue of knowledge. And this is where we see how knowledge is very useful in allowing us to assess works of art. There are two types of knowledge that Burke talks about. The first is knowledge of art itself, and he only touches on this very briefly. And the other type of knowledge is knowledge of reality or nature. So something like scientific knowledge, knowledge of the world. To give you an example, here's the painting The Anatomy Lesson by Rembrandt. If we look at this from the perspective of art, we might have knowledge that allows us to make sense of this painting. So we might say, well, the kind of genre that this belongs to is a kind of group painting, right? Portrait painting. And this was quite popular at the time. People wanted to be included. They might even have paid money to be in a certain position in this painting. Often entire groups, like guilds, for instance, were painted together, and Rembrandt makes a commission by doing this. So that's a kind of knowledge. And then we can talk about lines of sight. We can talk about perspective. We can talk about lighting, all of these different things. The other kind of knowledge has to do with reality. For instance, an anatomist might point out that the arm in the middle of this painting, which is being examined, is not actually represented faithfully or scientifically. It's fairly accurate, but there is perhaps a mistake. And scholars have recently pointed out that that is indeed true. The arm is not exactly right. So knowledge then can help us make an informed and sound judgment. And Burke is very strong about this. He gives the example, incidentally, of a Turkish emperor who sees a painting of John the Baptist being beheaded, and the emperor exclaims, well, that's not true to life, because if you look at the skin by the wound, it's not shriveling up. It's supposed to look a little bit different. And the emperor is so used to executions that he knows exactly what a dead head should look like. It's quite a grim example, actually. You may want to think about that, whether that is true taste. Does the Turkish emperor have true taste just because he knows some scientific detail? I'll leave that up to you to decide. So education is possible then, but opposed to this, to some extent, there's also the question of sensibility. And it may be harder to train our sensibilities. Burke struggles with this very much, and he comes back to it at the end of his essay. By sensibility, Burke means our feelings, but not just our senses, right? Our taste, touch, and so on. Sensibility is an almost more nebulous concept, where it means these feelings that are hard to describe. When we look at a painting, we feel pleasure, we feel pain, we feel stress, or whatever, and it's hard to kind of put that into words. Burke talks then about three kinds of pleasures that we can feel. And so one of these is pleasure in seeing an imitation, what's often called mimesis. If it's true to life, we get a kind of pleasure in seeing life being represented realistically. Another kind of pleasure has to do with beauty and the sublime. And we're going to talk about this quite a bit more, obviously, in future videos. But Burke is already saying that this is part of our sensibility. We don't have some kind of rational judgment where we look at a painting and we say, oh yeah, based on these criteria, this is beautiful. It's an almost automatic response. And then the last one here is sympathy, which for Burke is a social virtue. So Burke feels that by looking at works of art, we can become better and more sympathetic creatures. To sum up then, what we see is that for Burke, yes, our taste is rooted in the senses, and this allows us to be educated, to return to a kind of proper palette of senses. But there are also a number of tensions, for instance, between knowledge and sensibility. And I'm going to sum up a bunch of these tensions very quickly for you to think about, and I'll put them on the screen here. But we'll finish with this, and then in future videos, we're going to look more closely at how Burke talks about the sublime and the beautiful and develops those concepts. First of all, then, does knowledge come at the expense of pleasure? Is it the case that the more we know, the less we can spontaneously enjoy a work of art? You've probably seen this yourself, that somebody who knows very little might have the most intense feelings about a piece of music or a painting or a poem, right? So does knowledge actually destroy our immediate sensory pleasure? Secondly, can you train your feelings? You can get more knowledge, but can you train your feelings? Thirdly, does knowledge provide its own kind of pleasure? And Burke does say that judgment, we think back to using our judgment or intellect, judgment can give a kind of pride as we think that we are better than others because we know so much. But are there other kinds of pleasures as well, more refined pleasures that come with knowledge? Also, is ethics a matter of taste? And we've talked about this before. Can we really say that good and evil are matters of taste? Number 5, what about the politics of Burke's views? Is he democratic or elitist? If we all share the same taste, does that mean that we all have access to art? Or, because we can train ourselves through knowledge, is there actually an elitism where those who know more are more in tune with taste? 6, is taste spontaneous or reasoned? This becomes a big problem for the Romantics because the Romantic poets are struggling with this all the time. If you go out into nature, are you spontaneously affected by nature, or can you reason about it afterwards? And lastly, does Burke privilege realism in art? That's why we started with a modernist painting. What would he say about that? If so much is about imitation and the closeness to reality and the knowledge we have in terms of assessing whether it's realistic, is that really important? Does it really matter? More recent art has suggested that perhaps it's not as crucial.